What if the biggest royal decision of the summer wasn't made in front of cameras? What if it happened quietly at Sandringham, behind closed doors, while the world was distracted by Meghan Markle's birthday and the latest headlines surrounding the Sussexes? And what if the real target wasn't a public statement, a royal title, or another family confrontation, but Harry's place inside the financial legacy of the Windsor family? According to the scenario described in the source material, King Charles was preparing a sweeping change to the way royal wealth, inheritance, and historic family assets were protected. And if the claims are accurate, the consequences for Prince Harry could be far more serious than another royal disagreement. Because this story isn't simply about money. It is about who controls the Windsor legacy, who inherits it, who can access it, and whether Charles is quietly building a system that could outlast every argument inside the royal family. Before we get into the details, subscribe to our channel because we follow the stories behind the headlines and the decisions that could shape the future of the monarchy. Now here's where this story becomes fascinating. The alleged move begins at Sandringham. No grand announcement. No public confrontation. No cameras waiting outside. Just a private setting, legal documents, advisors, and a decision that could potentially change the rules surrounding royal assets. The source scenario places King Charles at the center of that decision. And the timing is presented as significant. While attention was focused on Meghan's birthday and the continuing media interest surrounding the Sussexes, the alleged legal work was taking place away from the spotlight. And that creates the first major question. Was the timing deliberate? The source scenario suggests it was. If the public was watching California, the palace could deal with paperwork in Britain with far less attention. But the real shock comes when we look at what the alleged restructuring was designed to accomplish. The central idea was a new boundary around inheritance. Under the scenario described in the source, beneficiaries living primarily outside the British Isles for a defined period could face restrictions on access to certain trust assets. For Harry, that would be crucial. He has built his life in California. So instead of the issue being whether Charles and Harry could repair their relationship, the question becomes whether Harry would still qualify under the new rules. That is a completely different kind of conflict. A family disagreement can change tomorrow. A legal condition does not care about tomorrow's apology. If the rules are written around residency, eligibility, and formal ownership, then emotions become almost irrelevant. And that may be the most calculated part of the alleged strategy. Charles wouldn't need to publicly attack Harry. He wouldn't need to explain himself. He wouldn't need another interview or statement. The paperwork would do the talking. But then the story takes an even more sensitive turn. Princess Diana. Anything connected to Diana carries extraordinary emotional weight within the royal family. Her jewelry, her photographs, her personal belongings, her letters, and the memories passed from one generation to the next. The source scenario claims that certain items associated with Diana's descendants could be affected by the alleged restructuring. One example described is a diamond and ruby tiara connected to Diana's history. The alleged change would involve treating such an object as part of an institutional or state-controlled collection rather than a private family asset. If that were the case, the consequences would be significant. Because there is a huge difference between something being available as a private inheritance and something being held as part of a permanent collection. A private object can move through a family. An institutional object is protected by a completely different set of rules. And suddenly, the issue isn't just Harry's money. It becomes Harry's connection to his mother's legacy. That is why the Diana element could make this story so explosive. Imagine being told that something your family believed would remain within future generations was no longer treated as a personal inheritance. The emotional impact would be enormous. But the source material goes even further. It introduces another alleged change involving Harry's teenage correspondence. According to the scenario, personal writings from Harry's younger years could become subject to control by another royal office. Why would that matter? Because Harry's personal history has become part of the public story of the monarchy. His memories have already played a major role in interviews, documentaries, and published accounts of royal life. Private letters and correspondence can become valuable historical material. They can provide context. They can reveal how someone thought before becoming a public figure. And they can potentially become part of future books or documentaries. So if control over those materials were transferred, the issue would no longer be simply ownership of old letters. It could become a question of who controls part of Harry's story. And that leads to one of the most intriguing questions in the entire scenario. Could the battle between Harry and the institution eventually move away from public interviews and into intellectual property? Instead of fighting through headlines, the conflict would be fought through ownership rights, archives, permissions, and legal documents. That is a much quieter battle, but potentially a much more powerful one. Then comes the alleged financial pressure point. According to the source scenario, challenging the new arrangement could expose sensitive information about a beneficiary's commercial activities. Think about what that could mean. Business agreements, publishing arrangements, media contracts, partnerships, investments, revenue, private financial records. If a legal dispute opened the door to that information, Harry would face a difficult choice. Accept the new arrangement and move forward, or challenge it and potentially expose far more of his financial affairs to scrutiny. That is why the alleged strategy is so interesting. It wouldn't need to threaten anyone publicly. The structure itself could create the pressure. And then, just when the story seems to be about Harry, William enters the picture. According to the source scenario, William was allegedly not fully aware of the changes until the process was already underway. That changes everything, because this would no longer be a simple Charles versus Harry story. It would become a story about the future king as well. William is the person expected to inherit the institution. So if Charles is changing how the institution's wealth is structured, William eventually has to live with those decisions. And there is an important contradiction here. The alleged changes could give William a stronger and more secure institution. But they could also leave him with less freedom over certain assets. That may sound strange, but consider the logic. If royal wealth is increasingly locked into structures designed to preserve historic buildings, collections, and institutional responsibilities, future monarchs could inherit greater stability while having less ability to redirect those resources personally. In other words, more protection, less flexibility. And that could be the real long-term strategy. Not simply protecting Charles's reign, protecting the crown after Charles is gone. Because Charles will not be king forever. William will eventually inherit the throne. Then George, and eventually another generation. So if the alleged restructuring is genuine, its real purpose may not be Harry at all. Harry may simply be the most visible example of a much larger change. A monarchy designed to make its core assets harder to challenge, divide, or remove. That is where the story becomes much bigger than a family feud. For decades, royal wealth has existed in a complicated space between personal inheritance, private property, and institutional responsibility. But the modern monarchy faces unprecedented scrutiny. Every financial decision can become a headline. Every royal possession can become a controversy. Every family disagreement can become a global media story. And when family members live very different lives, old informal understandings can become increasingly difficult to maintain. The alleged answer is simple. Turn expectations into rules. Turn traditions into legal structures. Turn family arrangements into formal boundaries. If that is what Charles is attempting, then the consequences could continue long after today's headlines disappear. Because a family argument can be forgotten, a legal structure can remain for decades. That is why the Sandringham element matters so much. Sandringham represents generations of Windsor history. It is associated with private royal life, family traditions, and the continuity of the monarchy. But the alleged documents represent something very different. A modern monarchy. A monarchy built around legal protection, financial controls, institutional ownership, and carefully defined inheritance. That raises another uncomfortable question. Is Charles protecting the crown from family instability? Or is he restricting his own family's freedom? Perhaps the answer is both. From the institutional point of view, protecting royal assets could be presented as responsible stewardship. From the family point of view, the same decision could feel like a dramatic loss of control. And that difference is important, because Charles may see a permanent trust as protection. Harry may see it as exclusion. William may see it as an inheritance with conditions. And the public may see it as another chapter in the long-running Windsor family conflict. But there is an even deeper consequence. What happens when family relationships become governed by paperwork? If inheritance requires clauses, if property requires classifications, if private possessions require legal definitions, if disagreements become potential court battles, then the relationship between family and institution begins to change. The monarchy becomes more protected, but perhaps less personal. That could be the true legacy of the alleged plan. Not simply who gets the money, not simply who gets the jewelry, not simply who controls the letters, but the transformation of how the Windsor family itself operates. Harry and Meghan chose an independent life outside the traditional royal system. William chose the path toward the throne. Charles now stands between those two realities. One son has moved away from the institution. The other is preparing to inherit it. And the king is responsible for deciding what parts of the old system should survive into the future. That makes the inheritance question especially important. Because when people hear that Harry could be cut off, they naturally think about money. But inheritance is about more than money. It is access. It is history. It is property. It is identity. It is the physical connection between one generation and the next. And when Diana is involved, that emotional dimension becomes even stronger. For Harry, anything connected to his mother has significance far beyond its financial value. For his children, those objects could represent a connection to a grandmother they never truly knew. So a change to the status of those items would not simply be a financial decision. It could become a decision about legacy. And that is why this alleged restructuring has such powerful emotional stakes. But there is still one question that remains unanswered. Why would Charles do this now? The source scenario points toward the growing complexity surrounding the modern royal family. A traditional system built around shared expectations becomes much harder to maintain when members of the family operate independently, sign major commercial agreements, and live outside the United Kingdom. Charles may therefore be looking beyond today's dispute. He may be looking at the next 50 years. What happens when William becomes king? What happens when George eventually inherits? What happens if another member of the family chooses an independent life abroad? What happens if future commercial ventures create conflicts with royal assets? A strong legal framework could theoretically answer those questions before they become crises. And that is why the alleged plan could be seen as a form of institutional insurance. It is not necessarily about one person. It is about preventing future problems. But there is a price. The stronger the rules become, the less room there is for exceptions. And that could explain why Harry's position would be so difficult to change. If the rules are designed around eligibility, residency, and institutional ownership, then returning to Britain might not automatically restore everything. Reconciliation might not restore everything. A private meeting might not restore everything. Even a change in personal relationships might not be enough. Because once the legal structure exists, changing it could require another formal decision. And that is much harder than changing someone's mind. Now consider William's position. If Charles is building this system for the long term, William could eventually become the guardian of a monarchy with stronger legal protections than ever before. That sounds like an advantage, but it comes with restrictions. A future king may have enormous constitutional authority while still being bound by the structures surrounding certain assets. The crown becomes stronger. The individual becomes less important. And perhaps that is exactly the direction a modern monarchy needs to survive. Because institutions survive individual personalities. Kings come and go. Family relationships change. Public opinion changes. But the institution has to continue. That may be the logic behind the alleged strategy. Make the crown less vulnerable to personal conflict. Make its assets harder to divide. Make its historical collections more secure. And make future generations inherit an institution rather than simply a fortune. If that is the goal, then Harry's situation becomes almost symbolic. He represents the possibility of a royal life outside the institution. William represents the future inside it. Charles is trying to determine how much the institution can protect itself from both. And that is why this story has the potential to become one of the most significant royal narratives of the year. Because the real question isn't simply whether Harry is being cut off. The real question is whether Charles is changing the rules so that the next generation cannot face the same conflict. If so, Harry may not be the final chapter. He could be the turning point. The old system relied on family relationships. The new system could rely on legal architecture. And that difference could define the Windsor family for decades. So where does that leave Harry? According to the scenario, he could face a future in which access to certain assets is no longer assumed. Diana-related objects could be placed beyond private inheritance. Historical correspondence could become subject to institutional control. Financial arrangements could become more restrictive. And any legal challenge could potentially create additional scrutiny. But there is another side to the story. If these measures are designed to protect the institution, then Charles could argue that they are not personal punishment. They are simply boundaries. The crown cannot function indefinitely on informal family promises. At some point, someone has to decide what belongs to the institution and what belongs to individuals. And Charles, as king, may believe that his responsibility is to make that distinction as clear as possible. That is where the entire controversy becomes so fascinating. Two completely different interpretations can exist at the same time. To one side, this looks like a father cutting off his son. To another, it looks like a monarch protecting the institution. To Harry, it could feel deeply personal. To William, it could be a complicated inheritance. And to future generations, it could simply become the normal way the monarchy manages its wealth. That may be the most important point of all. Today's controversy could become tomorrow's tradition. The decisions being discussed now could eventually seem completely ordinary to the next generation of royals. And if that happens, the biggest transformation will not be Harry's inheritance. It will be the rules themselves. The royal family has always evolved. But this would represent a different kind of evolution. Not a new title, not a new residence, not another public ceremony. A legal transformation. One that could quietly redefine the boundaries between family and crown. And that brings us back to Sandringham. A private estate. A quiet room. A document. A signature. And a decision that, according to the scenario described in the source material, could have consequences far beyond one royal family dispute. Because sometimes the most important royal stories don't begin with an announcement. They begin with paperwork. And the most important question may not be what Charles said to Harry. It may be what Charles put into writing. Was Harry really being pushed away from a Windsor inheritance? Was Diana's legacy becoming part of a larger institutional strategy? Was William being prepared for a more tightly controlled monarchy? Or is the bigger story that the crown itself is quietly changing the rules of the game? Whatever the final answer, one thing is clear. The battle over the future of the monarchy may not be fought with public arguments. It may be fought through ownership, inheritance, trusts, and the fine print. And if Charles is truly building a financial fortress around the crown, the consequences won't end with Harry. They could reach William. They could reach George. They could reach Harry's children. And they could shape the Windsor family long after today's headlines have disappeared. That is why this story matters. Because the most powerful royal decision may be the one nobody sees happening. Not a speech, not a press conference, not a public confrontation, just a signature. And sometimes, one signature can change the rules for an entire dynasty. If you want to stay ahead of the biggest stories coming from the British royal family, subscribe to our channel and join us as we uncover the decisions, secrets, and developments happening behind the crown.